The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Quirky Dog Podcast, inspired by some of the quirkiest dogs you can ever imagine and the owners who love them. This podcast is brought to you by the quirky couple themselves, Scott and Jess Williams. Their aim is to educate and entertain. Here's Scott and Jess.
Welcome, guys, and happy Wednesday. Today we are going to talk about the dark side of dog training, and what we mean by that is having to deal with behavioral euthanasia and having to recommend behavioral euthanasia and everything in between. So it's not going to be our most uplifting podcast, but it is an important topic out there in the industry. But first, we're going to start with the quirky tip of the day. All right, what's our quirky tip, Love Bug?
Don't kill the pig. The quirky tip, well, we talked about equipment and going over your equipment, your leash, your collars, and making sure that there isn't any weak points in your leash, maybe where your dog has chewed on it a little bit and it's partially compromised. Yeah, equipment failure. We've kind of had a few instances lately that's reminded us to re-up, like, oh, we need to have slip collars on pet dogs. Oh, we need to be using our biothane leashes because we trust these leashes and everything else. Not all equipment is created equal, and it becomes a safety issue. I mean, dogs can get loose, and it can be a problem. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have these cotton web, nylon web leashes that are very, very strong, and they have dogs that have chewed on the leashes periodically, and the leashes can handle a little bit of chewing here and there, but over time they start getting some weak points, and you don't want to have your dog pull on the street for some reason and have that leash pop on you. Yeah, break and open. Chewing, fraying or not, equipment just gets older. And that being said, if you're using a prong collar, you should have a slip collar, a backup collar, in case the first one pops open. You always have the second one. If you're using a gentle leader, you should have a slip collar on as a backup. Yeah, if you're using a front attach harness, you should have a slip collar on as a backup. Equipment failure can happen, and at worst, it can be inconvenient. Or at best, it can be inconvenient. At worst, it can be life or death. Dog could be hit by a car. Yeah. And I tell all my clients the same thing, and probably 75% of them do not use it, but I educate them, and then it's up to them. Yeah. If they decide not to use a little backup, that's on them. But we would never deal with someone else's dog and not have at least one layer of backup protection between us and a loose dog that we're chasing around the neighborhood or, God forbid, gets out in traffic. Yeah, and we're not grabbing an aggressive dog coming in for boot camp and using a leash from Dollar General. So watch your equipment, beware of equipment failure, and always safety first. Okay, so I guess this topic came up mostly because we had to recommend this recently, and we haven't really discussed this, but what would your number be of the dogs? Let's just say since we've been together, I don't think it even occurred much before those 13 years. The dogs that we know that we have recommended behavioral euthanasia for, not even evals and stuff, but like that we personally know, how many would you say? I don't know, but I would say it's probably a couple a year at least that I'm seeing. The dogs that we've actually touched, I would say that we know that have been put down, I would say closer to 6 to 8. With the evaluations, I'll give you that's more of that, but I was going without. I can't think of more than 6 to 8 clients over the past 13 years that we've seen, worked with, and then still recommended behavioral euthanasia. Yes, Scott sometimes, has somebody on the phone and he hears the situation and he says, honestly, the most ethical thing to do would be to euthanize this dog, or he sees a person for an eval and he goes, this dog is too dangerous for me to work with. This dog isn't safe in your home. He recommends behavioral euthanasia. But the dogs that we have, actually worked with in some capacity, whether it be classes or boot camp, and then that has ended in behavioral euthanasia, I would say the numbers are around 6 to 8 for us. So it's not that this podcast is trying to talk about methodologies and everything else, but I do think from a balanced perspective, sometimes it doesn't occur as frequently. But with that said, it still 100% is on the table, and it 100% is an issue that dog trainers are going to run into and deal with. So I guess most recently, we had some clients text us. They had a very aggressive rescue. We knew this dog had a lot of aggression. They had a baby a few years ago. We went there when they first had the baby. They've had about 2 to 3 years where everything was going well. And whatever happened, it was a new environment, everything else, they got somewhere. There was a bite incident with the child. He's a toddler now. And they texted us and they basically said, like,
we know the dog can't live in our home anymore. What should we do? And we, unfortunately, in this group text with them, said, as painful as it is, we think the best option is behavioral euthanasia. And it just kind of triggered in me that, like, not every dog that we train that has aggression is going to end up with behavioral euthanasia, because the fact that we actually have only had 6 to 8 clients actually have to follow through with this process is pretty low considering the amount of aggression we deal with. You all know about my finger now. We didn't recommend behavioral euthanasia for that dog. Like, it's not our normal go-to, but there are certain situations in which we know a dog has a certain level of aggression, it does have a bite history, and we don't really see any other options, and it totally sucks. It is especially when you have a long-standing relationship with these clients and you know this dog and you care about this dog and everything else, it's a really hard pill to swallow, and it's a really hard conversation to have, but it definitely does happen, and it definitely is one of the darker sides of dog training outside of all the other things that we talk about that are tedious and that our wear and tear on our lives and our stress levels and everything else. This is probably by far the hardest thing to have to encounter, and we definitely have encountered it at least once a year in some capacity, if not another.
Yeah, I think objectively looking at these dogs with the experience of a seasoned dog trainer, you can see the dogs that are candidates for euthanasia a mile away. What causes me to, or gets me to work with people, is if they've had the dog in their house for, a few years, and they're totally committed to the dog, and I'll talk about this with them. I'll say the dog is dangerous and the dog should be put down, and they're like, well, can we try working with the dog first? And I'll say, yeah, but at least we've talked about it on the front end, and now let's see if we can make this dog better and see if you can manage the dog effectively. And what I always say to people is that, the management, there can't be any slip-ups with management. And that's the tough part, because people, when they first start, they're really good about management. And then sometimes, and it's a long, exhausting thing to think about managing a dog for 7 to 10 years to make sure that that dog doesn't have contact with someone it doesn't know, and where is it going to stay if we're going to go away. That's a lot of management to think about. And some people do pretty well at it, and other people don't. They just, they mean well, they want to, they try, but emotionally they can't do it. They can't crate their dog when company comes over.
And one breakdown on the system
that's
is
it.
the end
I mean,
of life.
We had one that it just reminded me of this, where the dog bit a previous trainer. The dog was in a board and train program.
Very severely.
They went to pick the dog up.
Very severely.
The dog bit the trainer so badly, the woman had to go to the hospital. And they called me from there and said, listen, this is what happened. Would you be willing to look at the dog? And I said, yeah, bring the dog over. I don't know what happened there, but if I can handle the dog, let me see what you got going on. And I was able to handle the dog. I was able to work with the dog, and I wound up taking the dog for 2 weeks or something, 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, the dog did go after me during that time.
The dog did go after Jess, didn't get bit. I was able to handle the dog, get the dog in and out of a crate, do some obedience, and the dog was okay. And I said, you can live with this dog if you absolutely crate this dog.
Whenever anyone's on your property.
First it was at night. They said, we can't do that.
Yeah. I
said, okay, if anybody is coming to your home, this dog has to be in a crate. And they said, okay, we can do that. So that was kind of what I told them, because the dog was okay with them. And I just said, you cannot have any other living being in your house without this dog in a crate. Someone's going to get hurt. And sure enough, they had contractors come. They were doing some home improvement type work in the house. And she called me and said, hey, the dog just bit this guy. And I'm like, how did that happen? How is that possible? Well, we had the dog on the bed.
And the dog didn't even get off the bed.
Dog didn't get off the bed.
The contractor walked by. And even at that point, I mean, we don't have to go into the vets who are willing to do this, and not quite yet, but even at that point, our previous vet that we had seen with our own dogs at the time, who shared this client, called us and was like, do you really think this is the route that we have to go at the appointment? And we're like, yeah, like we do. Like,
they want to do medication.
We are suggesting this, like this dog is dangerous. So I want to say to you, when you say you can spot it from a mile away, if a dog's a candidate for behavioral euthanasia, what does that look like to you?
If it already has a bite history and like someone's gone to the hospital over this dog, there's certain triggers, and it's just, there's certain things, certain dogs. It's hard. I mean, you can go by the information, but sometimes I just don't have a good feeling about certain dogs.
So you specifically can spot it from a mile away, but that's not a general thing that people can spot.
I think a dog trainer that has been working with dogs for 10 years or more knows when there's a dog that's dangerous, and then, okay, now we have a dangerous dog.
Yeah, and I think
what
also...
is in the best interest of the public and these people and everyone.
And we also had another candidate that the dog wasn't, you couldn't have spotted him from a mile away. He was a pretty social dog. He actually played Frisbee on the return. He was a pretty nice little mix. He severely went after the owner's mother at some point, really hurt her hand. Dog came back in for training. And she also had a kid at the time. It was kind of an incident that came out of the blue. And then what happened with that specific situation is she didn't like the way the dog started interacting with the kid, but the dog had such weird vibes around her, like handing the leash off and stuff. We thought that was unsafe, so we recommended it there too. So it's not our normal go-to, but it is the type of situation if you know that the dog can seriously injure someone, if the dog already came from rescue, if the dog is not taken back by the breeder, if it's a purebred, if the breeder will not take the dog back and evaluate this for themselves and everything else, that is the most ethical thing to do. You don't want to go to a shelter situation and lie. Some places will take a dog with human aggression still and then rehome that dog out. It's not ethical. It's not a good thing to do. We already have enough problems in our society, and we have to be the ones sometimes to make the call and help guide these owners through. This is the best process, and this is what's best for the dog and for you and for society, just like Scott was saying.
And whenever there's kids involved, I just have a zero tolerance for aggression with children. I don't care. There's no fix. We're not going to take a dog that has had, at least a couple of live bites, real bites committed, really hurt somebody, and then expect that dog to be safe.
We do that all the time. We've had human aggressive dogs all the time, and then the owners have a kid and everything else, and it works here or there. But if there's any aggression directed towards the kid, Scott has zero tolerance policy for that.
Yeah, if they get a rescue and they have kids in the house and this dog is showing aggression, growling. I had a guy call who said he rescued a pit bull and the dog is great, but doesn't like his 6-year-old, growling at his 6-year-old. We need to fix it. I said, you're not going to fix it. I'm not going to fix it. Get rid of the dog.
Yeah,
You'd had the dog for a month. I said, get rid of the dog.
And there are incidences where maybe the dog has territorial aggression. Maybe, I don't know, XYZ, the dog has an incident in the past. The owners have enough control of the dog. They have kids. The dog is raised with the kids and everything else. But as soon as that aggression is ever turned towards the kids, we have a zero tolerance policy for that. And it's not like, we need to make nice. It's nothing. It doesn't even need to progress to a bite. We're talking, there's any growling towards the kids, any aggression towards the kids, no bueno. It's a deal breaker for us, 100%. All right, let's go to break super quick. When we get back, we're going to talk more about this uplifting topic of behavioral euthanasia.
Want to keep up with all the latest from the Quirky Dog podcast like me and Murphy here? Then make sure you head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe. Or if you prefer to listen to the madness, go on over to iTunes or Spotify and follow the Quirky Dog podcast. And hey, while you're there, leave a rating and review and let them know what you think of the show. Until then, keep it quirky.
So I want to talk a little bit about what these situations may look like with dogs that we have trained that do have human aggression. I mean, obviously, we are not immune to not having it be directed towards us. I'm still recovering from my bite. I got my staples out last week. I have another month of being in this splint. I still can't lift any weight. My bone still has a lot of growth to, fuse together and everything else. But what does it look like for these people who own these dogs? We help train them, and then how do we keep them safe in society? So one is muzzles, 100%. We want people to be able to get muzzles on their dogs, take their dogs to the vet in a muzzle, have protocols that if somebody comes over, the dog either has a really good bed command or the dog's good, comfortable in a crate. And by a good bed command, that also means that you're not going to be allowing the public to interact with your dog. If it's just like that moment when someone walks in and there's that real heightened anxiety and stuff when somebody's first coming into the house, sometimes the bed can subside things. It looks like a myriad of different things. But as Scott was saying, sometimes it is lifelong management. And if people are willing to step up and, provide that for their dog and take their dog for walks and take their dog, muzzled for walks and commit to crating. And we've said it a million times before, aggression and anxiety are often very closely tied together. You're not going to necessarily cure either of them, but if you get the dog so it's feeling more comfortable in its own skin, typically those aggressive triggers are toned down quite a bit. The dog that bit me most recently, and this is by far the most severe bite Scott and I have ever had in a pet dog situation. We're very fortunate for that, and we try to have a lot of protocols in place for that. Very high level of anxiety. Most of the dogs that we're talking about throughout this podcast, very high level of anxiety, also tied in with high levels of aggression. So it's not that we're promoting, you can train an aggressive dog and everything will be great and the dog can go out and be merry and live a normal life. The people that guarantee dog training and off-leash control and all this stuff, I don't understand how crazy, where they're coming from. It just seems so crazy and absurd to us. But the people who are willing to manage the dog, willing to put structure on their dog, willing to crate their dog, and willing to fulfill these multiple levels of management are the people that have been able to have children before and, keep the dog in the house, have been able to have, dogs in the crate safely when guests come over or something else. So there are ways, and if you are having aggression issues with your dog, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you work with a trainer, and even specifically maybe a balance trainer. If you've done a lot of the, reinforcement-based training and you haven't gotten where you want to be, it's not going to cure it. It's not going to get rid of it. But dogs sometimes really need to understand, like, oh, wow, loose leash walking means like really being next to my person, or sitting when I'm told really means sitting when I'm told, or being handled at the vet really means I can be handled at the vet. We're dealing with that right now with one of our clients, pretty extreme dog. Dog will not allow anyone to do anything to it. The owners, the vet, anything else. Scott and I made pretty good progress in the first session, just conditioning to a muzzle, me standing over the dog. Scott has to stand over the dog because my hand, I'm not using it as well as I used to. He's there. I can get close, get back. The dog has a muzzle on. It can try to bite us. And we just work through it. We slowly get the dog comfortable with handling. Handling is 100% something that you need to be able to do. You cannot walk into a vet's office and expect a vet tech or a vet or someone else to take your dog and handle your dog unless they're going to use general anesthesia for their own safety. But you should be able to muzzle your dog, hold your dog however you need to be restraining your dog, pick up its foot, take its temperature, flip it over and say, here, look at its belly. This is something that's on you if you're going to own an aggressive dog, and you need to go through these various levels to make sure that the dog can get medical care and that the veterinary staff can be safe and you can be safe.
You should be able to do that with any dog.
Yes, but especially aggressive dogs. Yeah. Like this is definitely on you.
Certainly, conditioning them to a muzzle. But getting back to the euthanasia, it's tough. I had to recommend this to some people that I saw a few months back. I guess it's about 6 months now, with a dog. It was the dog's fifth home, and it was only 11 months old, and the dog bit me pretty good, and my guard was down because it was a happy puppy in my eyes. The dog came running up, and I was petting the puppy and giving the puppy treats, and everything seemed happy-go-lucky, and I'm like, what's going on with this dog? And they're like, well, just a lot of energy, and I said, okay, and it's dragging them all over the place, and they'd only had the dog for a couple of weeks. And I said, any aggression issues? No. And they said the vet said that the dog should be medicated before the trainer saw the dog. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, why'd they say that? Well, it's just a lot of energy, like never anything about aggression. And so I said, okay, well, let's, and they had a dog in a harness. I said, well, let's put a collar on the dog. And I go to put the collar on the dog. And right when I'm switching the leash from the harness to the collar, the dog just turns around and nails me.
Yeah, it really went after Scott.
And I didn't want to let him go because I didn't want the dog loose on the street. I didn't have a collar on the dog yet, So I picked him up and put him on the hood of my car, and then we got him leashed up, and then they got me some roll of paper towels. I'm like, Jesus,
And Scott only said that because he deals with so many dogs, and it was the dog's fifth home. So it's very dependent on when we think it's the best route or not. And we have worked with many, many, many dogs who have lived a very, very happy life. And I'm not trying to fluff our pillows and, talk us up, but that many people would have recommended behavioral euthanasia right from the get-go, or from some, inventory or something else that they had written out before they even met trainers. So we do take on tough cases, but it's the type of situation that we see enough dogs and we know enough about, if a dog's had 5 homes and this dog is triggered that quickly just by some basic handling, that's a problem.
Somehow the history gets lost from house to house. No one really knows what's going on. It's just a high energy dog.
Yeah.
No, there's more going on there.
Yeah,
Trust me.
and I guess to me, and we do just have to touch on this because it comes up with this topic and it scares the living bejesus out of me. To me, I guess an almost darker side of dog training is when we finally have this conversation, the owners are on board, they're definitely crying. We may be crying depending on what dog it was and how close we were to it. We're attached to these dogs. We love these dogs too. We can't just take them all into our house when this happens, and for a multitude of reasons, but that's just not the life that we're going to live. When you finally get to that point and then you call your vet's office and your vet says no. That is, to me, a whole other can of worms with this situation that really bothers me. And we were talking about this incident before with this dog that we had that went after me. The vet calls at the appointment. Do you think there's anything we can do? And I appreciate that. I'll welcome a conversation. Like, yes, we don't want to just end a dog's life either. We're not talking about, convenient euthanasia or just some elective thing here. Like, this isn't what this is. These are dangerous dogs. There's a dog that we talk about quite frequently on the podcast. He was a Wheaton. He was a rescue, and the first day that we saw him, we said, no, this isn't the right dog for the household.
Well, they brought the dog in for me to evaluate before they adopted him.
And we said no.
I said, no, not a good dog.
Yeah, he was coming up the leash when you put him in the crate. They, were planning to have kids, a ton of anxiety, everything else. So we probably worked with that dog for 3 to 4 years, quite safely.
Well, they decided we're going to keep the dog.
They decided they were going to keep the dog way early on, and that's no fault of their own. This happens sometimes. We had trained that dog for many, many years. The dog had gone after them personally in different instances. They did have kids in the house. Dog never really had an issue with the kids, luckily. The straw that broke the camel's back was the dog went after the groomer at one point, and the dog used to be able to be groomed okay and everything else. Dog turned to bite the groomer, and that was it. Like this was the breaking point, and we said, now the dog can't be groomed. The dog can't this, everything else. What were you going to say?
One of the inconvenient things was that the dog would sleep on the husband's chest when he slept on the couch, but would guard him from the wife. Like if anybody came near him, this dog was going to bite him. In
a scary way. Yeah. So anyway, we had this conversation. These people are good clients of ours. We've trained their extended family. This was a hard swallow, a hard go. They called their vet. Their vet said, no, you need to have a consult with a veterinary behaviorist, which is going to cost them upwards of, $500 if they don't have insurance. We won't euthanize your dog. And they knew about this aggression history. I actually have video of this dog from last time we boarded this dog. And this wasn't his normal go-to. I had an iPad in the dog room. This is many, many years ago when we had a bigger kennel and stuff.
There's always an excuse.
But, he didn't do that as a default with us. I wouldn't have put up with that for 3 to 4 years. But this was how aggressive this dog was, and the vet refused to do this. So that's a pretty high level of aggression. And I don't think anyone from any methodology, from any background in anything animals could argue that it isn't. The vet had known this. They knew that there were small children in the house, and their veterinarian, when this family had finally made this dire choice of this is what we have to do, this is best for the dog and best for us, they said no after years of seeing this dog. And that, I guess, is what gets me sometimes is you see a veterinary behaviorist, you're on the medication track, you're working with a, positive trainer, you can get a fast track to a euthanasia. That's all fine and good. You went through the right steps, but you work with a balance trainer, you haven't tried medication yet. There's no amount of medication in the world that would have helped that dog. So, we helped them find a vet who was comfortable doing this. This was not convenient euthanasia. This was a dog that needed to be behaviorally euthanized for his behavior, for the safety of the family members and the safety of society. And then a vet that they had used for many, many years with their dogs said no. And that, I guess, is a whole other layer that gets me, that if we're going to have this really open conversation with these owners, with our clients about these animals that they love so dearly, that they have literally put so much time and energy and love into to try to help and try to rehab, and then they finally make that call, if they're getting pushback about following through with that decision, that's a whole other thing that I really can't even understand from any perspective. And I invite any behaviorist or any veterinarian or anyone to come on and discuss with me why that is. But I think it's quite unethical to say, no, let's keep this dog in a house with kids under 5 and try medication before we say that euthanasia is the right thing to do. And it's hard, because when you finally get the bravery to make this call and make this decision, and then now you have to second guess yourself because your medical team isn't following through with it, that's an issue. And we hear about that it's happened twice within the context of what we've talked about on the podcast. We hear about that. And that is something that I really think we should have more on the table in this industry to discuss, and we should all be more open to. And I'm not just saying let's put dogs down a dime a dozen. And I understand that there are many nice dogs in shelters that are euthanized that necessarily don't need to be. They have nice temperaments. It's just an overpopulation thing. But when owners finally get to this point, if they can bring that dog in muzzled, you as a veterinarian, I do feel is your medical and, professional duty to follow through with that action for the safety of the home, the best for the dog's mental state. This dog obviously was not well mentally, and for the safety of society.
Yeah, no, it's a tough call. And then if the dog does bite someone and you decide to do it, then they tell you, well, we have to cut the dog's head off, and they give you because of the rabies, they need to take a brain sample, which is another.
It's not a pleasant situation.
No, it's a very emotional thing, and you're thinking about that, and you're like, oh my God, or they say if you keep the dog in quarantine for 10 days and then do it. Well, if the dog bit a family member, you don't want that dog in your house for 10 days.
Yeah.
Like, the dog has got to go,
Yeah. So I guess it popped up. We've held off doing this podcast, not even really that intentionally, but it's a tough topic. We've been podcasting for many, many years now. We're way in over 225 podcasts, but we just had this conversation with these clients who we've literally known for 6 or 7 years. Like least, this isn't, and this dog has lived safely with this child for a long amount of time. They've done a lot of protocols. They didn't do anything wrong. Nothing broke down. We are not blaming any client or any situation or anything else that happens. Sometimes it's just a breaking point, and luckily, there has never been so much damage in any of these situations like this that, there's deformities and everything else. They've been relatively minor bites. Like when that dog bit the groomer probably wasn't even as injured as I was. It was just making that dog's world smaller and smaller and smaller with what they could actually accomplish with that dog. And it does come up, and it sucks when it does come up, but it is our right as professionals, as dog trainers, as people who should have a better understanding of dogs and behavior and everything else than a normal lay person or an owner who just wants to pour its whole heart into the dog to rehab the dog, that you are on board to make this call and to have this conversation. And it's never an easy conversation, and it's certainly not one that we take lightly. And we feel terrible for people when this has to happen. But sometimes it just is how things segue. And I guess as another aside for this whole thing, the people that do see the dark sides of rescue, that think, oh, we just need to throw so much money at this, and we need to save all these dogs, and this pit bull that, and I don't mean to say pit bull, but let's just say a bully breed and rescue that, mauled 4 people. He just needs, the right program and, the right love and care, and he just needs to be treated the right way. And, no, like cookies and rainbows don't fix this kind of stuff. Like if the dog is severely injuring any human and it's already in rescue, it never should leave rescue. Let's just put that out there first and foremost. But Scott's right. These people that, have had their dog, maybe 1 or 2 instances have popped up. They've had the dog since a puppy. They're committed to the dog. There can be a lot of success there if they're willing to implement all these different management techniques and follow through and have this dog in their mind 24/7. But you cannot save these dogs with love. There is no way, shape, or form that you can do that. And we personally haven't been able to see these dogs be saved through medication either. And I'm not saying that we can save them through training either, but sometimes we can keep them alive if they're very clear on the criteria of, oh, I don't lunge at that person. Oh, I sit at my vet and I'm muzzled while I get handled. Oh, I accept my crate. All these little things do make it possible for the dog to live to an elderly age sometime and then luckily get put down, which is still heart-wrenching. Oh my God, that's the worst, having to put your dog down. But at least when they've lived a long life and they're 12 or 15, it's a lot different than, a 3 or 4-year-old dog that you have to put down who is, healthy as far as a physical perspective goes, but obviously has some mental troubles.
Yeah, and we've had over the years, I can remember, more than one where it's more of a territorial aggression. And I remember this one couple came in with this dog that bit the neighbor and was, they just couldn't get a handle on it, and they were going to have a baby, and they were all stressed out about this dog with the baby, and it all worked out great. We did a lot of training. The dog was great with the baby, is great with his family, but the management comes in with strangers coming in the house, or, and then I think about, okay, what about kids' friends, a birthday party, all these type of things. That's when that dog has to be handled a certain way.
And,
the dog's
and
great
people have
with
no problem
their
creating
family.
in that kind of context. That's fine. But your dog's world is going to be smaller. Your dog is never going to be fixed from the aggression. You're never going to train the aggression out of this dog. And you're never going to, psychotropically medicate the aggression out of this dog. And you need to make sure you're on board. And it is a big commitment. Scott has owned many dogs in his lifetime that could have, severely hurt a person through protection, and they are in your head 24/7. Where is that dog? Who's going to watch that dog if I go here? What's going to happen if, my house catches on fire and, people have to come in, and it's 24/7.
And even in boarding situations, do these people understand, these working dogs, and can they handle the dog, moving them from one kennel to another and all these type of things in a safe way where the dog is comfortable and all that stuff? Because an accident can be a big problem.
Enter Scott and Jess. That's why we have so many loving clients and all of this over the years. But also the dogs mostly that have the really severe aggression, they come in for boarding now. They love us. And I do not take a dog in for boarding that I do not feel comfortable with at least putting a muzzle on, and maybe if I need to cone it, and handing them off to a veterinarian for, emergency vet care. So we need to be able to handle the dogs. The dogs need to be social with us. And this is just something that I want to say as very public balanced trainers, behavioral euthanasia exists. Behavioral euthanasia is a blessing. It is a terrible, terrible process to go through. We have friends that have gone through it. It is a hard, hard, hard swallow. You had to euthanize a dog back in the day that was aggressive with your kids. It is not an easy journey, no matter how you're going to, a client dog that he kind of ended up, keeping, and the kids loved him, and it was a whole to-do. It is a hard, hard swallow, but it is on the table for the balanced community 100%. And I just really want to invite everyone to think about what relationship will you have with your vet, and if your vet is not willing to follow through with behavioral euthanasia for one reason or another, in extreme aggression cases, maybe you should look at having more vets in your,
well, you'll have to
ballpark
find
here.
someone, that can take care of it for you.
Because it's just not okay when now you finally have mustered up the courage, you make the call, and they say no. That is not the vet's choice to say no with a dog who is aggressive in your home and you don't feel safe within your home. Okay, next week, we promise to be more uplifting. I think we might even bring a golden puppy on the podcast for next week, and that is always happy for everyone. And I honestly think of all the dogs that have come on the podcast and into this podcast studio, we've never had a golden. I'll have to cross-reference that, but I think this would be our first golden, which is crazy. But we have a super cute puppy at home that we are thinking of bringing for a podcast next week, talking about round 2 with the dogs and what that may look like. I hope that you guys gleaned something off of this podcast. I know that it was a little more serious than our normal podcast, but we thought it was worth discussing. And if you have anything that you need to discuss with us, feel free to email us at studio@thequirkydog.com. Thank you for joining us. Happy Wednesday, and we will see you next week. Keep it quirky.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.